The sentry was 40 yards away. Sergeant Thomas Blackwood could see the orange glow of the German's cigarette in the darkness. A tiny ember floating in the void above the Normandy cliff. The soldier was leaning against a stone wall, watching the English Channel, completely unaware that 12 British commandos were crouched in the shadows behind him. One man, one cigarette, one obstacle between the commandos and the radar station that was guiding German artillery onto the invasion beaches. In 6 hours, the largest amphibious assault in human history would begin. Thousands of Allied soldiers would die on those beaches below, and every one of them would be in greater danger as long as that radar station remained operational. Blackwood needed to kill this sentry. He needed to do it now, and he needed to do it without making a sound. The knife was not an option. 40 yards of open ground covered in loose gravel. Every footstep would crunch like thunder in the pre-dawn silence. The sentry would hear him coming from 30 feet away. He would scream. He would fire his weapon. He would wake every German soldier within a quarter mile. The Sten gun was not an option. Even the suppressed version made enough noise to echo off the stone walls of the station. The bolt cycling alone would carry in the still air. The Germans would know something was wrong before the body hit the ground. The Lee-Enfield was definitely not an option. The crack of a rifle shot would light up the night like a lightning bolt. Every sentry in the sector would go on alert. The mission would be compromised before it began. Blackwood reached for the weapon strapped across his back. The weapon that everyone in his unit had called a joke when it first arrived at their training camp. The weapon that looked like someone had welded a drainage pipe to a hunting rifle. The weapon that the commandos had nicknamed the Toy. He raised the Lisle Carbine to his shoulder and put the iron sights on the glowing ember of the German's cigarette. He squeezed the trigger. The sound was nothing. Less than nothing. A soft mechanical click, like a door closing in a distant room, immediately swallowed by the whisper of wind off the channel. No crack. No bang. No muzzle flash. Just the click of the bolt cycling and the faint hiss of gases escaping through the massive suppressor. 40 yards away, the cigarette dropped. The sentry slumped against the wall and slid silently to the ground. The night remained undisturbed. The other German sentries continued their patrols, oblivious to the fact that one of their number had just been erased from the world. The 12 commandos moved forward like shadows. They reached the radar station without firing another shot. Within 15 minutes, every German inside was dead. The equipment was destroyed, and the team was melting back into the darkness. When dawn broke over Normandy and the invasion began, that radar station was silent. The German artillery batteries it was supposed to guide fired blind, their shells scattering harmlessly across empty beaches. Nobody ever knew how many Allied soldiers survived D-Day because of that silent shot in the darkness. The weapon that made it possible had arrived in British hands barely 6 months earlier, and its journey from mockery to legend was as strange as the weapon itself. The problem had been identified by the Special Operations Executive in 1942. They called it the noise gap. Modern warfare had created a tactical void that no existing weapon could fill. Snipers could kill from hundreds of yards, but their rifles produced sonic booms that announced their presence to every enemy in earshot. Knives could kill silently, but they required the assassin to close-to-contact distance, often across terrain where detection was inevitable. What the SO needed was something in between. A weapon that could kill quietly from a safe distance. A weapon that could neutralize a sentry without alerting his comrades. A weapon that could bridge the gap between the stealth of the knife and the reach of the rifle. The military experts said it was impossible. Suppressed weapons existed, of course. The Welrod pistol was already proving its worth in close-quarters assassination, but the Welrod was a contact weapon, effective only at arm's length. The SO needed something with range, something that could reach out to 50 or 100 yards and still remain silent. The physics seemed to work against them. A bullet traveling at supersonic speeds produces a crack when it breaks the sound barrier, regardless of whether the muzzle blast is suppressed. You could silence the gun, but you couldn't silence the bullet. The sound would still travel, unless you slowed the bullet down. William Godfray de Lisle was not a professional weapons designer. He was an amateur engineer, a civilian tinkerer who had spent years experimenting with suppressor technology in his private workshop. When the SO put out a call for solutions to the noise gap problem, de Lisle submitted a design that made the military experts laugh out loud. He proposed building a weapon from the parts of 3 different guns. The action would come from a Lee-Enfield bolt-action rifle, the most reliable mechanism in the British arsenal. The barrel would be custom-built to fire 45 ACP pistol ammunition, the same heavy, slow bullet used in the American Thompson submachine gun. And the suppressor would be a massive tube that wrapped around the barrel like an industrial exhaust pipe. The combination was ridiculous. The Lee-Enfield was designed for .303 British rifle cartridges, not stubby pistol rounds. The 45 ACP was designed for close-quarters combat, not precision shooting at rifle distances. The suppressor was so large and heavy that it would make the weapon unwieldy and front-heavy. The military experts rejected the design. They called it a monstrosity. They called it a Frankenstein creation. They called it a toy that had no place on the battlefield. De Lisle built it anyway. The civilian inventor understood something that the professionals had missed. The 45 ACP bullet was not just slow. It was specifically subsonic. The heavy 230-grain projectile traveled at approximately 850 feet per second, well below the 1,125 feet per second speed of sound. There was no sonic crack because there was no sonic barrier being broken. If you could eliminate the muzzle blast through suppression, and if you used a bullet that didn't break the sound barrier, you could create a weapon that was truly silent. Not quiet, not muffled. Silent. The suppressor that de Lisle designed was a work of industrial genius. It wasn't a simple tube attached to the barrel. It was an integral system that wrapped around the entire barrel assembly, featuring a series of baffles and chambers that trapped and cooled the expanding gases before they could escape into the atmosphere. When the weapon fired, the gases that would normally create the explosive crack of a gunshot were captured inside the suppressor. They expanded slowly through the baffle system, losing energy with each chamber they passed through. By the time they escaped into the open air, they were barely warmer than body temperature and moving slower than a man could walk. The result was a weapon that produced approximately 85 decibels when fired. For comparison, a normal conversation produces about 60 decibels. A car engine produces about 95. The Lisle Carbine was quieter than a car idling in a driveway. At any distance greater than a few dozen feet, the sound was completely inaudible. When de Lisle finally demonstrated his prototype for the SO, the observers were stunned. They had expected a complicated mess that wouldn't function reliably. Instead, they watched him put 5 rounds into a target at 75 yards, and the loudest sound in the room was the metallic click of the bolt cycling between shots. Nobody called it a toy after that demonstration. The Lisle Carbine entered production in early 1944. Only about 130 were ever manufactured, hand-built by skilled craftsmen who understood that each weapon might mean the difference between a mission's success and the death of an entire commando team. The commandos who received the de Lisle had to unlearn everything they knew about firearms. They were trained to expect noise. They were trained to brace for recoil and muzzle blast. They were trained to time their shots to cover noise, to fire during thunderstorms or artillery barrages. The de Lisle required none of this. The first time most commandos fired it, they thought it had misfired. The sound was so faint, the recoil so gentle, that their brains couldn't process that a shot had actually been fired. They would look at the weapon in confusion, check the chamber, verify that a round had indeed been expended. Then they would look at the target and see the hole. The 45 ACP round might have been slow, but it was devastatingly effective at close range. The heavy bullet carried enormous kinetic energy that transferred completely to the target on impact. A hit to the torso would drop a man instantly. A hit to the head would end any possibility of an alarm being raised. The commandos learned to trust the soft click. They learned that the absence of sound was itself a kind of weapon. The enemy could not defend against something they couldn't hear coming. In Burma, the de Lisle found its most terrifying application. The jungle campaign against the Japanese was a nightmare of ambush and counter-ambush. Both sides prowled through the vegetation like predators, listening for any sound that might reveal the presence of enemy soldiers. A cough could get you killed. A snapping twig could bring a mortar barrage down on your position. The British Commandos operating behind Japanese lines discovered that the de Lisle was perfect for this environment. They could eliminate Japanese sentries without alerting the main force. They could pick off officers and NCOs from concealed positions without revealing their location. They could create chaos and terror among enemy units that never understood how their men were dying. The Japanese called them ghosts. They developed elaborate rituals to ward off the spirits that seemed to be killing their soldiers in the night. Sentries would be found dead at their posts, with no sign of struggle. No indication of what had killed them except for a single wound that hadn't produced enough noise to wake anyone. Lance Corporal Arthur Webb spent 3 months operating with a de Lisle in the Burmese jungle. He later described the experience in terms that reflected both the weapon's effectiveness and its psychological weight. "You squeeze the trigger, and nothing happens," he said. "Just a little click. And then you look through the sights, and the man you were aiming at is falling down. It doesn't feel like shooting. It feels like pointing a finger and watching someone die. That takes something from you. That changes something inside your head that never quite changes back." The silent death had a cost for those who delivered it. But in the brutal calculus of war, that cost was considered acceptable. The Lisle Carbine remained in service long after World War II ended. Its principles were so effective that special operations forces continued to use variants of the design well into the modern era. The concept of integral suppression combined with subsonic ammunition became the foundation for virtually every silent weapon system developed in the following decades. When modern special forces carry suppressed weapons into high-value target operations, they are using technology that traces directly back to William de Lisle's workshop experiments. The civilian tinkerer who built a Frankenstein gun from mismatched parts had solved a problem that professional engineers said was impossible. The weapon that everyone called a toy became the template for a new kind of warfare. The drainpipe that the commandos mocked became the ancestor of every suppressed rifle and carbine in current military service. De Lisle himself never achieved the recognition he deserved. He wasn't a professional inventor or a military contractor. He was just a man who saw a problem and refused to accept that it couldn't be solved. He died in relative obscurity, his contribution to Allied victory largely unknown outside of classified operational reports. But the commandos who used his creation remembered. They remembered the night before D-Day when a single silent shot opened the door to a radar station. They remembered the Burmese jungles where Japanese soldiers died without hearing the gunfire that killed them. They remembered the soft click that preceded oblivion, the faint hiss of gases escaping through baffles, the absence of sound that was more terrifying than any explosion. The Lisle Carbine proved something that military procurement officials would spend decades trying to forget. Sometimes the best weapon doesn't come from a defense contractor with a billion-dollar budget. Sometimes it comes from a civilian workshop where an amateur refuses to believe the experts who say something is impossible. The noise gap was real. The physics said it couldn't be bridged. The professionals said a silent weapon with rifle range was a fantasy. And then a man named William de Lisle built one anyway. He used parts from 3 different guns. He wrapped a barrel in what looked like a drain pipe. He created something ugly, ungainly, and completely unprecedented. The experts laughed. The commandos mocked it. Everyone called it a toy until they saw what it could do. Then they called it something else entirely. They called it the ghost gun, the silent death, the weapon that whispers. They called it the solution to a problem that wasn't supposed to have a solution. Sergeant Blackwood carried a de Lisle carbine through 3 more operations after the radar station. He never fired more than 2 rounds in any engagement. He never needed to. The weapon did exactly what de Lisle had designed it to do. It bridged the noise gap. It killed without sound. It turned shadows into death and silence into victory. 40 years later, Blackwood was interviewed by a military historian researching suppressed weapons. The old commando was asked what he remembered most about the de Lisle carbine. "The silence," he said after a long pause. "Not just the weapon's silence. The silence after. No alarms, no shouting, no chaos. Just the wind and the waves and 12 men walking through a doorway that shouldn't have been open. That's what I remember. The silence that meant we had done something impossible. He smiled slightly, the expression of a man remembering ghosts. They called it a toy. They said it wouldn't work, and then we used it to open the door to D-Day without anyone hearing us knock. If de Lisle's story of civilian genius defeating military skepticism hit you the way it hit me, smash that like button right now. Every like tells the algorithm that the silent weapons that changed history deserve to be remembered. If you're not subscribed, now is the time, because next week we're uncovering another makeshift weapon that proved the experts catastrophically wrong. Drop a comment and answer honestly. If you were standing in that darkness before D-Day with a weapon everyone called a toy, would you trust it with your mission and your life? I want to know. I'll see you in the next one.